The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Ouagadougou's central courthouse, casting pale beams of light across the worn wooden benches. The air hung heavy with the smell of old paper files and decades of accumulated dust, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation. This was supposed to be an ordinary military hearing, just another routine case in the seemingly endless procession of justice, or rather, the lack thereof, that characterized the Burkinabe judicial system. The courthouse itself was a relic from colonial times, its walls bearing the scars of history. Peeling paint revealed layers of different eras, each one representing a different promise of justice that had been made and broken. The ceiling fans creaked overhead, their blades cutting through. The humid air with a rhythmic whir that had become the soundtrack to countless broken dreams and shattered hopes. On the benches sat ordinary citizens who had walked miles to witness this hearing. Some had arrived before dawn, their feet dusty from the long journey along unpaved roads. They sat in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. After all, they had seen this show before. The powerful would remain powerful, and the powerless would remain crushed beneath the boot of corruption. But today would be different. Today, the very foundations of this corrupt system would begin to crack. In the center of the courtroom, occupying the defendant's seat with an almost spiritual composure, sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His military uniform was crisp and clean, pressed to perfection despite the circumstances that had brought him here. His eyes were calm, penetrating, and filled with a quiet determination that seemed to radiate an almost otherworldly strength. This was not a man who had come to beg for mercy. This was not a man who had come to play by the rules of a rigged game. This was a man who had come to expose the very nature of the system itself. Captain Traoré's presence in the courtroom was itself a statement. While others fidgeted nervously, while others looked down at their feet or whispered anxiously to their lawyers, Ibrahim sat perfectly still. His posture was that of a man at peace with his conscience, a man who knew that history was watching, and that what happened in this courtroom would echo far beyond its four walls. In the eyes of some spectators, there was respect bordering on reverence. These were the people who had heard whispers of Ibrahim's reputation, a military officer who refused to participate in the systematic looting of the nation's resources, who had stood up to his superiors when asked to turn a blind eye to injustice, who had chosen honor over advancement. In other eyes, there were prayers being silently offered, desperate pleas to a higher power that perhaps this time, just this once, justice might prevail. And then there were those whose hearts harbored nothing but hope, hope that had been buried so deep beneath layers of disappointment and despair that they had almost forgotten it existed. But Ibrahim's very presence seemed to excavate that hope, bringing it back to the surface where it could breathe again. Judge Kabore sat at his elevated bench, mechanically flipping through files with the detached efficiency of a man who had long ago sold his soul to the highest bidder. His face was a mask of bureaucratic indifference, carefully cultivated over years of looking the other way, of rubber-stamping injustices, of serving power rather than truth. The lines around his eyes told the story of a conscience that had been slowly eroded, worn away like stone beneath a constant drip of compromise and corruption. Kabore had not always been this way. There was a time, decades ago, when he had believed in the law, when he had seen the judiciary as a noble calling, a sacred trust. But that idealism had been ground down year after year, case after case, until all that remained was a hollow shell going through the motions. He had learned that in Burkina Faso, the law was not blind, it was simply for sale. Standing along the walls of the courtroom were uniformed officers, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes trained to see everything while revealing nothing. They were the enforcers of this corrupt system, the muscle that backed up the charade of justice with the threat of violence. They had learned long ago not to question orders, not to distinguish between right and wrong, but simply to obey whoever held power at any given moment. But among these officers, one stood out. Officer Sankara, No relation to the martyred revolutionary Thomas Sankara, though the shared name was a bitter irony. This Sankara was everything the revolutionary leader had fought against. His eyes held a particular bitterness, a rage that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface, always threatening to boil over. His face bore the marks of years spent enforcing a corrupt regime, years of taking bribes, administering beatings, and crushing any spark of resistance beneath his expensive imported boots. For Officer Sankara, Ibrahim Traoré represented everything he despised. Here was a man who had refused to play the game, who had rejected the system of patronage and corruption that Sankara had mastered. Ibrahim's very existence was a rebuke, a living accusation that made Sankara feel small and dirty and exposed. Every time he looked at Ibrahim, he saw a mirror reflecting back everything he had become, and he hated what he saw. The courtroom fell into an expectant silence. The kind of silence that precedes either great violence or great change, or perhaps both. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe itself knew that something momentous was about to unfold. Time seemed to move differently in that moment. The dust motes floating in the shafts of sunlight appeared to freeze in midair. The creaking of the ceiling fans faded into the background. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the drama unfolding before them. Though no one yet understood that they were witnessing the opening act of a revolution, Officer Sankara's rage had been building for weeks, perhaps months, perhaps years. It was the rage of a man who had sold his integrity and now resented anyone who refused to do the same. It was the rage of someone who knew, deep in his corrupted heart, that he had chosen the wrong path, and who therefore needed to destroy anyone who reminded him of what he might have been. He had been watching Ibrahim throughout the hearing, his jaw clenching tighter with each passing moment. Every time Ibrahim spoke with quiet dignity, every time he refused to show fear or submission, Sankara felt his rage growing. This upstart captain needed to be taught a lesson. He needed to be shown that honor was worthless in the real world, that idealism was just another word for stupidity, that the only thing that mattered was power. Without warning, without any conscious decision, Sankara's body moved. Years of brutal conditioning took over. His boot, polished to a mirror shine with money taken from bribes, swung upward with practiced violence. The kick landed squarely in Ibrahim's ribcage with a sickening thud that echoed through the stunned courtroom. The impact sent Ibrahim's chair skidding backward. His body jerked from the force of the blow, his hand instinctively moving to his side, where pain bloomed like a dark flower. For a moment, everything stopped. The entire courtroom froze in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Violence was not uncommon in Burkina Faso, but this brazen assault in a courtroom in front of a judge, in full view of citizens and cameras, this was something else entirely. But what happened next was even more shocking than the kick itself. Ibrahim did not cry out. He did not curse or threaten. He did not even show anger on his face. Instead, he simply straightened himself slowly, methodically, with a grace that seemed almost superhuman under the circumstances. His eyes remained calm, focused, burning with an inner fire that was not rage, but something far more powerful, conviction. His silence was more eloquent than any words could have been. It spoke of dignity that could not be kicked away, of principles that could not be beaten into submission, of a spirit that refused to be broken no matter what physical violence was inflicted upon the body. In that moment of absolute stillness, Ibrahim Traoré transformed from a defendant into a symbol, from an individual into an idea that could not be killed with boots or bullets. The courtroom erupted. Some people screamed in shock and outrage. Others covered their mouths in horror, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Still others, blessed with the foresight to understand the historical significance of this moment, pulled out their mobile phones and began recording. Among those who immediately understood the importance of documenting this moment was Musa, a university student who had skipped his morning classes to attend this hearing. Musa belonged to a generation that had grown up watching their country being systematically looted by corrupt officials, watching their friends and family members suffer under the weight of institutional injustice, watching their hopes for the future being crushed year after year. His hands were shaking, but his fingers were steady as they held his phone, capturing every second of what was unfolding before him. Musa knew that this video would be important. He didn't yet know just how important it would become, how it would spread across social media like wildfire, how it would be shared millions of times, how it would become the rallying cry for a movement. All he knew in that moment was that history was happening, and he needed to make sure the world could see it. In the gallery, among the ordinary citizens who had come to witness this hearing, sat Mama Fatou. She was a woman of indeterminate age, her face lined with the kind of wrinkles that come not just from years but from hardship. She had walked 3 kilometers that morning to reach the courthouse, her legs aching with every step because she had heard that something important might happen today. She had lived through so much: colonial rule, independence, coups, famines, and the slow, grinding corruption that had become the defining feature of her country's governance. Mama Fatou clutched her colorful scarf tightly in her fist as she watched Sankara's boot connect with Ibrahim's ribs. Her body began to shake, not with fear, but with a complex mixture of emotions she could barely name. The tears that streamed down her weathered cheeks were not just for Ibrahim. They were for every person who had ever been beaten by police, for every family that had been forced to pay bribes just to access basic services, for every child who had died because corrupt officials had stolen the money meant for hospitals. She had lived her entire life in a system designed to keep people like her powerless and silent. She had watched her husband die after a routine medical procedure went wrong because the doctor had been drunk. Drunk because he was depressed. Depressed because he hadn't been paid in months. Unpaid because officials higher up the chain had embezzled the healthcare budget. She had watched her daughter drop out of school because the teacher demanded money the family didn't have. She had watched her son beaten by police for the crime of asking why, and now, watching Ibrahim absorb that blow with such dignity, watching him refuse to be broken, something deep within Mama Fatou began to shift. It was as if a door had been opened in a room that had been locked for decades, letting in fresh air and sunlight. She realized in that moment that she was not powerless. None of them were powerless. They had simply been taught to believe they were. Across the gallery sat Professor Caboret, no relation to Judge Caboret, though the shared surname was another of those small ironies that seemed to define Burkina Faso. The professor had spent his entire career teaching about justice, about revolution, about the power of the people to effect change. But it had all been academic, theoretical, safe. He had never truly believed that the things he taught in his classroom could actually happen in the real world. Now, watching this scene unfold before him, Professor Caboret felt something crack inside his chest. All his years of lecturing, all his scholarly papers about social movements and popular uprising, all his carefully cited references to historical revolutions, they all seemed hollow compared to what was happening right in front of him. This was not theory. This was not an academic exercise. This was reality in all its brutal, beautiful truth. His eyes fixed on the ceiling as tears began to form, and in his mind, he was already composing the lecture he would give to his students tomorrow. No, not a lecture, a testimony. He would tell them about this day, about how he had witnessed the birth of something new, about how a single act of violence had paradoxically become the catalyst for profound change. Near the back of the gallery sat Baba Sadougou, a retired soldier who had fought in the wars of independence. His gnarled hands gripped his walking stick with such force that his knuckles had turned white. At 83 years old, he had thought he had seen everything. He had seen colonizers driven out. He had seen the euphoria of independence, and he had seen the slow, heartbreaking betrayal of everything they had fought for. Baba Sadougou's generation had liberated Burkina Faso from foreign rule only to watch it fall under the tyranny of its own corrupt elite. They had traded white masters for black ones, and in some ways, the new oppression was even more bitter because it came from their own people. The revolutionaries of his youth had promised that independence would bring justice, prosperity, and dignity. Instead, it had brought new forms of exploitation. New hierarchies of power, new justifications for old injustices. But watching Ibrahim Traoré in that moment, Baba Sadugo felt something he hadn't felt in decades: hope. Not the naive hope of youth, but the tested, tempered hope of someone who had lived long enough to know that change was possible, even if it was rare. He whispered under his breath, his voice cracking with emotion. "This is the moment we've been waiting for. This is what we fought for, even if we didn't know it at the time." Officer Sankara stood frozen, his boot still slightly raised from the momentum of his kick. For a brief moment, he had felt powerful, triumphant even. He had put this arrogant captain in his place, reminded him that idealism was no match for brute force, demonstrated once again that in Burkina Faso, might made right. But as the seconds ticked by and he saw the reaction in the courtroom, that feeling of triumph began to curdle into something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. The faces surrounding him were not showing the coward submission he had expected. Instead, they showed shock, yes, but also something more dangerous: anger, determination, awakening. And then there was Ibrahim himself. Sankara had expected to see pain, humiliation, perhaps even tears. Instead, he saw only that same calm dignity, those same steady eyes that seemed to look not at him, but through him, seeing everything he had been and everything he had become. In Ibrahim's gaze, Sankara saw himself reflected back, not as the powerful enforcer he imagined himself to be, but as something small and pathetic and contemptible. For the first time in years, Sankara felt genuine fear. Not fear of physical harm. He was still armed, still dangerous, still protected by his position in the corrupt hierarchy. No, this was a different kind of fear. It was the fear of exposure, the fear of being revealed for what he truly was. It was the fear that came from realizing that he had just made a catastrophic mistake, that his moment of rage had transformed him from an oppressor into a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Sweat began to form on his forehead, despite the relatively cool morning air. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He found himself unable to meet anyone's eyes, his gaze darting around the courtroom like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. The very people he had terrorized for years were now looking at him with something approaching pity. And that was perhaps the worst part of all. He had gone from being feared to being pitied, and in his twisted value system, that was the ultimate humiliation. Sankara's mind raced back to his origins. He had been born in a small village, the son of farmers who had scraped together every franc they could find to send him to school. He had been so proud when he was accepted into the police academy, so certain that he would make his parents proud, that he would be a force for good in his community. His mother had wept with joy, telling everyone in the village that her son was going to be an officer of the law. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The idealistic young recruit had encountered the grinding reality of a corrupt system. He had watched as his fellow officers took bribes and got rich while he struggled to make ends meet on his meager salary. He had seen how those who played along got promoted while those who tried to stay honest were pushed aside or eliminated entirely. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, he had made a series of small compromises that had accumulated into the complete abandonment of his principles. The first bribe he took had made him sick to his stomach. He had barely been able to sleep that night, tormented by guilt and shame. But the second bribe was easier. And the third easier still. After a while, it became routine, just part of the job, the way things were done. He told himself that he was being pragmatic, that refusing to participate in the system wouldn't change anything except make him poor and powerless. And now, standing in this courtroom, facing the consequences of his accumulated betrayals, Sankara realized with bitter clarity that he had become exactly the kind of person his younger self would have despised. The village boy who had dreamed of bringing justice to his community had transformed into a petty tyrant who terrorized the innocent to protect the powerful. The ancient telephone in the courtroom suddenly rang, its shrill bell cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. It was an old rotary phone, a relic from the colonial era that somehow had never been replaced. Its mustard yellow plastic faded and cracked with age. Most people had forgotten it even worked. In fact, no one could remember the last time they had heard it ring. Judge Kabore's face, already pale from the shock of witnessing Sankara's assault, now turned absolutely white. His hands trembled as he reached for the receiver, nearly knocking it off its cradle. Every eye in the courtroom followed his movement, sensing that this call was not ordinary, that it was somehow connected to the extraordinary events that were unfolding. "Hello?" Judge Kabore's voice was barely above a whisper, cracking with anxiety. The voice on the other end of the line spoke in French, but it was not the French of the old colonial masters. This was the French of international authority, of the United Nations, of global human rights mechanisms that had the power to shine a spotlight on the darkest corners of the world. The voice was calm, measured, but carried an unmistakable weight of power and purpose. "Monsieur le juge, I trust you understand the seriousness of what has just occurred in your courtroom." Judge Kabore felt his legs go weak. He gripped the edge of his desk to steady himself, his mind racing to understand how anyone could possibly know what had just happened. The assault had occurred mere minutes ago. How could word have already reached wherever this call was coming from? But of course, he realized. The phones, the video cameras. In this modern age, nothing remained hidden for long. Musa's video was probably already spreading across social media, being shared thousands of times, reaching audiences far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. The old ways of covering up injustice, of ensuring that witnesses remained silent, of controlling the narrative, those days were over. The caller continued. "My name is Salif Sankara." Judge Kabore's intake of breath was audible. "I am the younger brother of Thomas Sankara, and I currently serve as a human rights advisor to the United Nations in Geneva. I have just watched a video of Captain Ibrahim Traoré being assaulted in your courtroom by an officer under your jurisdiction. The world is watching, Monsieur le Juge. The world is watching, and we will not remain silent." Thomas Sankara. The name itself was almost sacred in Burkina Faso, or at least it should have been. The revolutionary president who had renamed the country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of the upright people. The leader who had fought against corruption, championed women's rights, rejected foreign aid that came with strings attached, and challenged the very foundations of neo-colonial exploitation. The man who had been assassinated in 1987 in a coup that had ushered in decades of corruption and oppression, and now his brother, carrying on his legacy from Geneva, was on the phone, holding Judge Kabore accountable for what had just occurred in his courtroom. The symbolism was almost too perfect, too poetic. It was as if Thomas Sankara himself was reaching from beyond the grave, reminding Burkina Faso of the principles it had once stood for, calling it back to its better nature. "We have evidence," Salif Sankara continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Video evidence, witness testimony, documentation. This assault did not occur in a vacuum. It is part of a systematic pattern of abuse and corruption. The question now, Monsieur le Juge, is what you will do about it. Will you be complicit in this injustice, or will you choose to be part of the solution?" The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes transformed Judge Kabore. When he finally hung up the phone, his hands were no longer shaking. His back, which had been bent with the weight of years of moral compromise, straightened. He looked around the courtroom with new eyes, seeing it not as the place where he had presided over countless travesties of justice, but as the place where he could finally do something right. Judge Kabore's voice, when he finally spoke, was strong and clear in a way it hadn't been for years. "Order in the court," he commanded, and this time there was real authority behind the words. Not the borrowed authority of a corrupt system, but the genuine authority that comes from acting in accordance with conscience. The guards, who had been standing uncertainly along the walls, suddenly straightened. They had been in this courtroom countless times, had witnessed countless injustices, had learned to look away and follow orders without question. But something in Judge Kabore's voice, something in the entire atmosphere of the room, told them that this time was different. "Officer Sankara," Judge Kabore's words fell like hammer blows, "you are hereby charged with assault against the accused, contempt of court, and abuse of your office. I am ordering your immediate arrest." The words seemed to echo in the stunned silence that followed. No one could quite believe what they were hearing. In all their years of watching the Burkinabe justice system operate, they had never seen one of the system's enforcers held accountable. The police and military operated with complete impunity, secure in the knowledge that their connections and their role in maintaining the corrupt order would protect them from any consequences. But today, that certainty had shattered. Sankara's face went through a rapid series of transformations, from shock to disbelief to desperate rage to, finally, fear. He looked around the courtroom wildly, as if expecting someone to intervene, to call off this absurd charade, to restore the natural order where men like him were above the law. But no one moved to help him. The other officers along the wall remained still, watching with expressions that were impossible to read. Perhaps they were shocked. Perhaps they were secretly pleased to see the bully get his comeuppance. Perhaps they were simply waiting to see which way the wind would blow before deciding which side to support. Sergeant Diongo, a young officer who had once idolized Sankara, stepped forward. In his hands, he held handcuffs. The same handcuffs that he had seen Sankara use countless times on people who were guilty of nothing more than being poor, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or refusing to pay a bribe. Diongo had joined the police force with ideals not unlike those that had once motivated Sankara. He wanted to serve his community, to protect the innocent, to uphold the law. But working under Sankara, he had been forced to participate in activities that made him sick with shame. He had beaten people who didn't deserve it. He had extracted confessions through threats and violence. He had stood by while Sankara and others enriched themselves through corruption. Every day, Diongo had gone home and looked at himself in the mirror, barely recognizing the person looking back at him. He had told himself that he was just following orders, that he was powerless to change the system, that speaking out would only get him killed or dismissed. But the guilt had eaten away at him, corroding his spirit day by day. Now, approaching Sankara with those handcuffs, Diongo felt something break free inside his chest. This was his chance at redemption, his opportunity to take a stand, his moment to become the officer he had always wanted to be. "Sir," Diongo's voice was quiet but firm. "Please extend your hands." Sankara's eyes met Diongo's, and in that moment, an entire conversation happened without words. Sankara's eyes pleaded, threatened, promised rewards, reminded Diongo of all the times they had worked together. But Diongo's eyes remained steady, conveying a message that was simple and final. No more. The clicking of the handcuffs seemed to reverberate through the courtroom like gunshots. Those small metal circles closing around Sankara's wrists were more than just physical restraints. They were symbols of a fundamental shift in power. Proof that the seemingly invincible apparatus of corruption could be challenged and defeated. The gallery erupted. Some people wept openly. Others shouted in jubilation. Mama Fatu raised her hands to the sky, her voice breaking as she cried out, "I live to see this day! Thank you, God, I lived to see this day." Professor Caboret was furiously scribbling notes, already planning the book he would write about this moment. Musa's phone continued recording, capturing every second of history being made. And Baba Sadugu struck his walking stick against the floor with such force that it cracked, tears streaming down his weathered face as he witnessed the beginning of the redemption he had fought for so many decades ago. But Judge Kabore was not finished. Having taken the first step toward justice, having broken through decades of moral paralysis, he found himself wanting, needing to go further. The phone call from Salif Sankara had awakened something in him, something he had thought long dead. It was his conscience, his sense of right and wrong, the idealistic young law student who had once believed that the judiciary could be a force for good in the world. He stood up from his bench, an action that caused a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Judges didn't typically stand during proceedings. It violated protocol, disturbed the careful choreography of courtroom ritual. But Judge Kabore was beyond caring about protocol. This moment was too important for the usual formalities. "Captain Ibrahim Traoré," his voice rang out clear and strong, reaching every corner of the courtroom. "On behalf of this court and the Republic of Burkina Faso, I offer you our profound apology for the inhumane treatment you have suffered here today." The words seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with significance. An apology from a court to a defendant. It was unprecedented. In all the history of Burkina Faso's judiciary, no one could remember such a thing ever happening before. The powerful did not apologize to the weak. The system did not apologize to those it oppressed. That was simply not how things worked, but Judge Traoré had broken that pattern, had shattered that expectation. His apology was more than just words. It was an acknowledgement that the system had failed, that justice had been perverted, that the sacred trust placed in the judiciary had been betrayed. Ibrahim slowly rose to his feet. The pain in his ribs was evident in the careful way he moved, but his face remained composed. He looked at Judge Traoré for a long moment, and in that gaze, there was understanding, forgiveness, and something that might have been hope. "Your Honor," Ibrahim's voice was quiet but carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "This apology is not for me. It is for the millions who have never been heard, for the countless victims of injustice who never got their day in court, who never saw their oppressors held accountable. Today, with your words and your actions, you have taken the first step toward giving them a voice. For that, I thank you." The exchange was brief, but its impact was seismic. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between the Burkinabe people and their institutions. The wall of cynicism and despair that had built up over decades began to crack. Perhaps, just perhaps, change was possible. Perhaps justice was not merely an empty word used by the powerful to legitimize their oppression. Perhaps the system could be redeemed. Mama Fatou's tears flowed freely now, but they were no longer tears of sorrow or rage. They were tears of catharsis, of release, of hope reborn. Professor Traoré closed his notebook, realizing that no words he could write would adequately capture the power of what he had just witnessed. Baba Sadugu closed his eyes, lips moving in a silent prayer of gratitude. As Officer Sankara was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, head bowed in shame, the real work of the revolution was just beginning. Musa's video had already gone viral. Within an hour of the assault, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Within a day, millions would see it. The video would be shared across every social media platform, discussed on television news programs, analyzed by international human rights organizations. But more importantly, it would be watched in homes across Burkina Faso, in the capital city of Ouagadougou, and in remote villages that barely had electricity. People would gather around phones and computer screens, playing the video over and over, barely able to believe what they were seeing. An officer held accountable, a judge apologizing, a system, however briefly, functioning the way it was supposed to. In markets and shops throughout Ouagadougou, the video became the sole topic of conversation. Merchants who usually competed with each other now stood together, watching the clip on shared phones, discussing what it might mean. Could this really be the beginning of something? Could one act of justice really spark a larger transformation? In schools, teachers abandoned their lesson plans to discuss what had happened. Students who had grown up believing that corruption was simply the natural order of things, as inevitable as the sunrise, began to question that assumption. Perhaps things could be different. Perhaps they could be part of making them different. In the rural areas, where life moved at a slower pace and traditional values still held sway, the news spread through word of mouth, enhanced and embellished with each retelling until it took on an almost mythical quality. The story of Captain Ibrahim, the man who remained silent in the face of violence, who absorbed brutality with dignity, who sparked a revolution through his refusal to be broken. Radio Omega, one of the few independent media outlets in the country, immediately devoted its programming to covering the story. Journalists who had grown accustomed to censorship and intimidation suddenly found themselves able to speak freely, to ask the questions that had been forbidden, to give voice to the anger and hope that had been suppressed for so long. "What we witnessed today," one journalist said on air, his voice thick with emotion, "was not just the arrest of one corrupt officer. It was proof that the system can change, that justice is possible, that we, the people, have more power than we knew." International media picked up the story quickly. Within hours, news organizations from around the world were reporting on the events in Ouagadougou. Headlines blazed across newspapers and websites. A kick that shook a nation. The birth of Burkina Faso's new revolution. When silence speaks louder than words, human rights organizations swung into action. Amnesty International issued a statement calling for Captain Ibrahim to be released and for a full investigation into systematic abuses within Burkina Faso's security forces. Human Rights Watch announced they would be sending a delegation to investigate. The African Union expressed concern and called for transparency and accountability. But perhaps most importantly, ordinary Burkinabe citizens began to organize. Students at the University of Ouagadougou called for a demonstration in support of Captain Ibrahim and against police brutality. Labor unions announced they would be holding meetings to discuss taking collective action. Community organizations began coordinating efforts to document other cases of abuse and corruption. The movement was spontaneous, organic, unstoppable. It was as if the entire nation had been a pot of water that had been heating for years, getting hotter and hotter, and Sankara's kick had been the final degree that caused it to boil over. All the accumulated frustration, anger, and grief of decades suddenly found an outlet, a focus, a reason to hope that action might actually make a difference. As Captain Ibrahim Traoré left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight, he was met by a crowd of thousands. They had gathered spontaneously, drawn by news of what had happened, wanting to see with their own eyes this man who had become, in the space of a few hours, the symbol of resistance and dignity. The crowd erupted in cheers as he appeared. Some people held signs with messages of support. Others simply reached out, wanting to touch him, as if some of his courage might transfer to them through physical contact. Ibrahim moved through the crowd slowly, acknowledging their support with quiet nods, occasionally stopping to grasp someone's hand or listen to their words of encouragement. But who was this man who had become, seemingly overnight, a national hero? Ibrahim Traoré's story was not particularly unusual in Burkina Faso. He had been born in a modest neighborhood of Ouagadougou, the son of a schoolteacher mother and a mechanic father. His parents had worked hard to provide for their children, instilling in them values of honesty, dignity, and service to others. Ibrahim had excelled in school, showing particular aptitude for mathematics and history. His teachers recognized his potential and encouraged him to pursue higher education. But the family lacked the resources to send him to university, so Ibrahim had made the decision to join the military. It was a practical choice. The military offered a steady income, opportunities for advancement, and the chance to serve his country. He had taken to military life surprisingly well. While some of his fellow recruits struggled with the discipline and hierarchy, Ibrahim found meaning in the structure and purpose. He rose through the ranks steadily, earning a reputation as a skilled tactician and a natural leader. His subordinates respected him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and because he treated them with fairness and dignity. But Ibrahim's military career had taken a complicated turn when he was promoted to captain and assigned to a unit, responsible for overseeing government contracts. It was in this position that he first encountered the depth and breadth of the corruption that permeated every level of Burkinabe society. Military procurement was supposed to be a straightforward process. Identify needs, solicit bids, select the best vendor based on quality and price, oversee delivery. But Ibrahim quickly discovered that the reality was far different from the official procedures. Contracts were awarded not to the most qualified bidders, but to companies owned by relatives of high-ranking officials. Equipment that was never delivered was nevertheless paid for, with the money disappearing into private accounts. Substandard goods were accepted without inspection, endangering the lives of soldiers who would depend on them. When Ibrahim had raised concerns about these practices, he was initially ignored. His superiors acted as if he had committed some sort of social faux pas by mentioning the obvious corruption. When he persisted, the responses became more threatening. He was told that he didn't understand how things worked, that he needed to be a team player, that his career would suffer if he didn't learn to look the other way. But Ibrahim couldn't look the other way. Every time he saw substandard boots that would give soldiers blisters on long marches, every time he saw vehicles that broke down because they'd been purchased from a friend of someone important rather than a qualified manufacturer, every time he saw resources that should have gone to serving the nation instead disappearing into private pockets, he felt physically sick. His refusal to participate in the corruption made him an anomaly, a threat to a system that functioned on the assumption that everyone was complicit. And so, inevitably, he had been brought up on charges. The specific accusations were vague and clearly fabricated: misappropriation of funds, insubordination, conduct unbecoming an officer. Everyone involved knew the real reason for his prosecution. He had refused to play the game. Now, standing outside the courthouse surrounded by thousands of supporters, Ibrahim reflected on the strange path that had led to this moment. He had not set out to be a revolutionary. He had not intended to spark a movement. He had simply tried to do his job with integrity, to serve his country rather than enriching himself at its expense. The fact that such basic honesty had made him a pariah within the system spoke volumes about how far that system had fallen. "Captain Traoré," a voice called out from the crowd. Ibrahim turned to see an elderly man pushing his way through the throng. The man's face was weathered and worn, but his eyes burned with an intensity that suggested a spirit far younger than his body. "Yes," Ibrahim responded, extending his hand. The old man grasped it firmly. "My name is Kofi. 30 years ago, I was a soldier in this army. I watched good men die because they were given defective ammunition purchased through corrupt contracts. I have waited 3 decades to see someone stand up to that corruption." "Thank you. Thank you for having the courage I lacked." Ibrahim felt tears prick at his eyes. "You don't need to thank me, brother. We are all part of this struggle. Your survival, your witness, that took courage, too." Similar encounters repeated themselves as Ibrahim made his way through the crowd. A woman whose husband had been beaten to death by police for questioning an unjust arrest. A young man whose brother had disappeared after refusing to pay a bribe. An elderly couple who had lost their life savings to a fraudulent investment scheme run by a government official. Each had their own story of injustice, their own wounds that the system had inflicted. And each saw in Ibrahim's stand a validation of their suffering, a promise that perhaps justice might be possible after all. In the presidential palace, located in one of the wealthier districts of Ouagadougou, an emergency meeting was taking place. President Damiba sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by his ministers and advisors. The atmosphere in the room was tense, charged with anxiety and barely suppressed panic. How did this happen? President Damiba's voice was controlled, but those who knew him well could hear the fury underneath. How did a simple military hearing turn into an international incident? The Minister of Justice shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Sir, it appears that the officer in question, Sankara, acted independently. There was no authorization for him to assault the defendant. And Judge Caboret's subsequent actions, the arrest, the apology, these were also unauthorized." "Unauthorized?" President Damiba's hand slammed down on the table. "I don't care whether they were authorized. The question is why they happened at all. We had this situation contained. Traoré was supposed to be convicted, quietly sentenced, and forgotten. Instead, he's become a national hero, and we're facing international scrutiny." The Minister of Defense spoke up. "Sir, if I may, the video has been shared millions of times. The international community is watching closely. If we move against Traoré now, or if we attempt to reverse Judge Caboret's decision, we'll face significant backlash. So what are you suggesting? That we do nothing? That we let some junior officer dictate policy to this government?" "Sir," the Minister of Foreign Affairs interjected carefully, "perhaps we need to consider this as an opportunity rather than a crisis. Public sentiment is clearly on Traoré's side. If we position ourselves as supporting transparency and accountability—" President Damiba laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You want me to pretend to support the very principles that threaten our entire way of operating? Do you understand what that would mean? If we start actually enforcing accountability, where does it stop? Today it's Sankara. Tomorrow someone might demand accountability from ministers. Eventually they might demand it from me." The room fell silent. Everyone present understood that President Damiba had just articulated the fundamental dilemma facing any corrupt system when confronted with demands for reform. Allowing even a small measure of genuine accountability threatened to unravel the entire edifice of corruption and patronage that kept them all in power. "However," the president continued, his tone shifting to something more calculating, "the Minister of Foreign Affairs has a point about public perception. We cannot appear to be opposing justice and transparency, even if that's exactly what we're doing. So here's what will happen. We will issue a statement expressing our full support for Judge Caboret's decision. We will call for a comprehensive investigation into corruption within the security forces. We will establish a commission to examine military procurement processes. But, sir, one of the ministers began. I'm not finished. President Damiba cut him off. We will do all of these things publicly with great fanfare. And then we will ensure that nothing actually comes of them. The investigation will be slow, inconclusive, and ultimately find no systematic problems. The commission will issue recommendations that are never implemented. Judge Caboret will discover that his career advancement depends on his willingness to remember this as an isolated incident rather than part of a pattern. And Captain Traoré, well, he will have an unfortunate accident at some point in the future, when international attention has moved on to other matters. The ministers nodded, understanding the plan. It was the standard playbook for authoritarian governments facing public pressure. Make symbolic concessions while ensuring that nothing fundamentally changes. Give the people just enough to satisfy them in the moment. Then quietly restore the status quo once the spotlight had moved elsewhere. But what President Damiba and his ministers didn't fully appreciate was that this moment was different. The video had captured something that couldn't be easily contained or controlled, a feeling, an awakening, a collective realization among the Burkinabe people that they didn't have to accept injustice as inevitable. That genie couldn't be put back in the bottle through clever political maneuvering. In the days following the courtroom incident, Burkina Faso began to transform. It started small, a group of university students organizing a peaceful protest outside the courthouse, demanding accountability for other cases of police brutality. A few dozen people showed up on the first day. By the third day, it was hundreds. By the end of the week, thousands. The protest organizers, led by Musa and other young activists, were careful to keep things peaceful and focused. They created a list of specific demands: the release of all political prisoners, an independent investigation into corruption within the security forces, reform of the judicial system to ensure real independence, and constitutional changes to limit presidential power. But more importantly, they created a space where people could tell their stories. Each day, the protest would pause, and someone would step forward to share their experience of injustice. A farmer whose land had been stolen by a government official. A mother whose daughter had been raped by a police officer who was never charged. A businessman whose competitor had used corrupt connections to destroy his livelihood. A teacher who hadn't been paid in months because education funds had been embezzled. These testimonies were recorded and shared online, creating a growing archive of injustice that made it impossible to dismiss the protests as the work of a few troublemakers. This wasn't about one incident or one person. It was about a system that had failed millions of people over decades. Similar protests began springing up in other cities across Burkina Faso. In Bobo Dioulasso, the country's second-largest city, workers organized a general strike. In Koudougou, women's groups held a vigil for all those who had died due to the corruption that had gutted the healthcare system. In smaller towns and villages, community members began holding meetings to discuss how they could participate in this growing movement. The government's response was initially uncertain. President Damiba's plan to make symbolic concessions while changing nothing fundamental was undermined by the fact that the people were demanding real change, not symbols. When the government announced its comprehensive investigation, protest leaders immediately pointed out that the commission was staffed entirely with government loyalists and had no independent oversight. Security forces were ordered to monitor the protests but not to intervene violently. The government had learned from the courtroom incident that brutality would only fuel the movement. But this restraint created its own problems. Rank-and-file officers, watching the protests grow larger and more confident each day, began to question whose side they were on. Sergeant Diongo, the officer who had arrested Sankara, became a symbol of this internal conflict within the security forces. He began speaking publicly about the corruption he had witnessed, the orders he regretted following, the systemic abuses that made good policing impossible. His testimony gave other officers permission to speak out, to question, to imagine that they could be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. For years, I told myself I was just following orders, Diongo said at one of the protests, his voice amplified by a megaphone. But following orders to do wrong is still doing wrong. We in the security forces have a choice. We can continue to be the instruments of oppression, or we can remember our oath to protect and serve the people. His words resonated not just with other officers, but with anyone who had ever felt complicit in injustice, who had ever made compromises they regretted, who had ever wondered if individual actions could make a difference. Diongo's transformation from enforcer to reformer offered a model of redemption that was immensely powerful. The international response to events in Burkina Faso continued to intensify. Salif Sankara, calling from Geneva, organized a coalition of human rights organizations, UN agencies, and sympathetic governments to put pressure on the Damiba regime. He understood that domestic pressure alone might not be sufficient. To overcome the entrenched power of corruption, external leverage was also needed. The European Union announced it was reviewing its aid to Burkina Faso and would condition future assistance on demonstrable progress toward judicial independence and accountability. France, the former colonial power that had long supported authoritarian regimes in its former African colonies in exchange for political and economic access, found itself caught in an uncomfortable position. Progressive voices in Paris demanded that France stop enabling corruption in Africa, while traditional foreign policy establishment argued for maintaining stability, even if it meant supporting authoritarian rule. The United States Congress held hearings on corruption in West Africa, with Burkina Faso featured prominently. American lawmakers, responsive to pressure from diaspora communities and human rights advocates, began calling for targeted sanctions against corrupt Burkinabe officials. The possibility that they might lose access to their foreign bank accounts and their children's education at Western universities concentrated minds wonderfully among the elite. The African Union, often criticized for its unwillingness to hold member states accountable for human rights abuses, found itself under pressure to take a stronger stand. Civil society organizations across Africa pointed to Burkina Faso as a test case. Would the AU stand with the people demanding accountability, or with the governments resisting it? But perhaps most importantly, the story resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders because it touched on themes that were universal. Around the world, people were struggling against corruption, authoritarianism, and the abuse of power. The image of Captain Ibrahim absorbing that kick with dignity, refusing to be broken, spoke to everyone who had ever felt powerless against an unjust system. Social media exploded with solidarity messages. Justice for Ibrahim and Burkina Faso awaits trended globally. Artists created murals depicting Ibrahim's steadfast calm in the face of violence. Musicians wrote songs about the moment. His story was shared in contexts far removed from West African politics. In Hong Kong, protests against Chinese authoritarianism. In Indian movements against government corruption, in Latin American struggles for social justice, Ibrahim himself was somewhat bemused by his transformation into an international symbol. In interviews, he consistently tried to redirect attention away from himself and toward the broader movement. "I am not special," he insisted. "I simply did what anyone with conscience would do, refused to participate in injustice. The real heroes are the people who have been fighting this corruption for years, who have suffered far more than I have, who have never had the spotlight on their struggles." But his modesty only made him more compelling as a symbol. In an era of self-promotion and celebrity, here was someone who genuinely seemed to care more about the cause than about personal glory. As the movement continued to grow, the elements of Burkinabe society that benefited from the corrupt status quo began to organize their response. They couldn't simply crush the protests with violence. International attention made that too risky. But they could try to undermine, divide, and deflect. State media began running stories questioning the protesters' motives. Were they truly interested in reform, or were they pawns of foreign interests seeking to destabilize Burkina Faso? Articles appeared suggesting that Captain Ibrahim was actually an agent of Western intelligence agencies. Anonymous sources claimed that the video had been staged. that Sankara's kick had been a performance designed to spark exactly this kind of unrest. These narratives gained little traction with the broader public. Too many people had been in the courtroom. Too many had witnessed events firsthand. But they didn't need to convince everyone. They just needed to create enough doubt to prevent the movement from achieving total unity. The government also tried to divide the protesters along ethnic and regional lines, a time-tested strategy in African politics. Whispered campaigns suggested that the movement was dominated by certain ethnic groups seeking to take power from others. In a country with a history of ethnic tensions, this approach had potential to create serious problems, but the protest organizers had anticipated this tactic and worked hard to ensure diverse representation in leadership positions. They made sure that every public event featured speakers from different ethnic groups, different regions, different social classes. They framed their demands in explicitly national terms. This wasn't about one group gaining advantage over another, but about creating a system that worked fairly for everyone. More concerning was the emergence of violence at some protests. Unidentified men would appear at demonstrations and begin throwing stones at police or starting fires or engaging in looting. The government would then use these incidents as justification for crackdowns, claiming they needed to restore order and protect property. The protest organizers suspected, and some intelligence sources later confirmed, that many of these provocateurs were actually security forces in plain clothes, deliberately trying to discredit the movement. They responded by organizing volunteer security teams at protests, trained in nonviolent methods, whose job was to identify and isolate anyone engaging in violence. "We will not give them an excuse to crush us," Musa declared at one planning meeting. "Our strength is our moral clarity. We are demanding justice, transparency, accountability, all things that no reasonable person can oppose. If we allow ourselves to be provoked into violence, we lose that moral high ground." The most serious threat, however, came not from attempts to discredit the movement, but from efforts to co-opt it. Government officials began making contact with some protest leaders, offering them positions, money, influence, anything to get them to moderate their demands or split from the main movement. Some activists were indeed bought off. The movement discovered that one of their prominent spokespersons had been secretly meeting with government officials and counseling a more pragmatic approach. When this was revealed, it caused a crisis of confidence. If one leader could be corrupted, how many others might be compromised? But the movement proved resilient. The leaders who had been bought off were exposed and cast out. New leaders emerged to replace them, often younger, often with less to lose and therefore harder to buy. The decentralized nature of the movement, which had initially seemed like a weakness, turned out to be a strength. There was no single leader to arrest, no central organization to infiltrate and destroy. The crisis came to a head 2 months after the courtroom incident. The government, frustrated by its inability to quell the protests through co-option or discreditation, decided to make a show of force. President Damiba announced on national television that while he respected peaceful protest, he could not allow chaos and disorder to continue indefinitely. He declared a state of emergency and issued orders for the security forces to clear the protests. The announcement sparked panic among the protesters. Many had feared this moment would come, when the government would finally lose patience and resort to the violence that had always been its ultimate source of power. Memories of previous crackdowns, of massacres at protests in other African countries, of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China, all these weighed heavily on everyone's minds. But something unexpected happened. When the orders came down the chain of command, many officers refused to carry them out. Sergeant Diongo was one of the first to publicly announce he would not participate in any violent crackdown on peaceful protesters. Within hours, dozens of other officers joined him. By the next morning, entire units had declared they would not obey orders to attack their own people. The mutiny spread rapidly through the ranks. Junior officers, who had been quietly questioning the regime but feared the consequences of speaking out, suddenly found courage in numbers. If everyone refused together, they couldn't all be punished, and many of them had family members participating in the protests, or had been moved by the stories of injustice they had heard. or simply felt that enough was enough. President Damiba found himself in an impossible position. He had issued orders that his own security forces were refusing to carry out. If he backed down, he would appear weak, encouraging further defiance. But if he tried to punish the refusing officers, he risked pushing even more of the military into open rebellion. In the presidential palace, the emergency meetings became increasingly frantic. Some advisors counseled compromise, offer real reforms, show the people that the government was listening, buy time to consolidate control. Others argued for doubling down, arrest the ringleaders, bring in loyal units from outside the capital, crush the rebellion before it spread further. But before President Damiba could decide on a course of action, events overtook him. A group of mid-ranking military officers, led by Colonel Traoré, no relation to Ibrahim, announced they were taking control to restore constitutional order and allow the people's will to be expressed. It was a coup, but one with a crucial difference. It was explicitly positioning itself as being in service of the reform movement rather than against it. The coup leaders immediately announced free. Elections would be held within 6 months, that a transitional government, including civilian representatives, would be formed to draft constitutional reforms, and that all political prisoners would be released. They arrested President Damiba and several of his top officials on corruption charges. The reaction among the protesters was complicated. On one hand, this appeared to be what they had been fighting for, the removal of a corrupt government and a path toward real reform. On the other hand, they were suspicious of military intervention. Africa's history was littered with military coups that had promised democracy and delivered more authoritarianism. Captain Ibrahim Traoré found himself in a particularly delicate position. The coup leaders wanted him to join the transitional government, seeing his moral authority as crucial for legitimizing their actions. But Ibrahim was deeply ambivalent. He had not sparked this movement to replace one military government with another, even one that claimed better intentions. The people did not risk their lives protesting just to have soldiers decide their future, Ibrahim said in a statement. Any transitional government must be truly civilian-led, with the military playing only a supporting role. And there must be ironclad guarantees that elections will be held on schedule, with international monitoring to ensure they are free and fair. His conditions put pressure on the coup leaders, who suddenly found that their attempt to ride the revolutionary wave required them to actually deliver on their promises. The international community, led by Salif Sankara and others, made clear that legitimacy and support would depend on following through on commitments to democracy. The months that followed were chaotic, uncertain, and at times frightening. Transitional governments are inherently unstable, and there were many forces that wanted to see this one fail. Hardliners within the military who opposed reform staged an attempted counter-coup, which was only narrowly defeated. Economic interests that had profited from corruption fought a rearguard action to protect their advantages. International actors with stakes in the status quo worked behind the scenes to undermine progress. But the movement that had started in that courtroom proved more durable than anyone had expected. The protesters maintained pressure on the transitional government, keeping their organizations active, continuing to demonstrate whenever it seemed like promises might be broken. They had learned that winning the initial victory was only the beginning. Maintaining momentum and ensuring that change was actually implemented required constant vigilance. Judge Kabore, who had played such a crucial role in the initial breakthrough, became head of a special judicial commission tasked with investigating past corruption and human rights abuses. It was both an honor and a burden. He knew that many powerful people would try to obstruct the commission's work, that witnesses would be intimidated, that evidence would disappear. But Kabore approached the work with the same moral clarity he had discovered in that moment when he arrested Officer Sankara. "I spent decades failing in my duty as a judge," he said. "I have only a few years left to try to make amends. I will use them to ensure that the truth comes out, regardless of who it implicates." The Commission's investigations revealed a staggering scope of corruption. Billions of dollars had been stolen from state coffers over the years. The healthcare system had been gutted, with funds meant for hospitals and medicines diverted to private accounts. The education system had been systematically undermined. Infrastructure projects had been used as vehicles for embezzlement on a massive scale. Reading the Commission's reports, ordinary Burkinabe citizens felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at the theft that had impoverished them. Grief for all the suffering that could have been prevented if resources had been used properly. But also validation. Their complaints had not been imaginary. Their sense that the system was rigged had been accurate. Officer Sankara, whose kick had inadvertently sparked this entire chain of events, was tried and convicted of assault and corruption. His sentence was relatively light, 5 years in prison, but he would serve every day of it. There would be no pardon, no early release, no special treatment. For perhaps the first time in Burkinabe history, a member of the security forces was being held fully accountable for abusing power. In prison, Sankara had time to reflect on the choices that had brought him there. He was visited by Sergeant Diongo, who had arrested him that day in court. The two men sat across from each other in the visiting room, separated by a table but connected by their shared history. "Why did you come?" Sankara asked. "Because I wanted you to know that I don't hate you," Diongo replied. "I hated what you did, what you became. But I understand how it happened. I was walking the same path you walked. I could have become you, if things had gone differently." Sankara was silent for a long moment. "Does it matter? Whether you hate me or not? I'm still here. My life is still destroyed. It matters because you're not the only one who needs to change. All of us do. The system that made you possible, that rewarded corruption and punished integrity, that system is finally being dismantled. But it can't be fully dismantled unless those of us who participated in it acknowledge what we did and commit to being different." The conversation continued for over an hour. By the end, both men were in tears. Tears of regret, of recognition, of tentative hope that perhaps redemption was possible even for those who had done terrible things. The promised elections took place on schedule, monitored by international observers who declared them the freest and fairest in Burkina Faso's history. The outcome was surprising to some. No single party won a majority, necessitating a coalition government. But this turned out to be a strength rather than a weakness. The need to build consensus across different factions created a more representative government and made it harder for any one group to dominate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had resisted all calls for him to run for office. "I am a soldier, not a politician," he insisted. "My role was to spark the conversation, not to dominate it." But he did accept a position as an advisor on military reform, working to transform the armed forces from an instrument of oppression into a genuine protector of the people. The new constitution, drafted through a participatory process that included input from civil society organizations across the country, included strong provisions for judicial independence, civilian control of the military, and transparency in government operations. It wasn't perfect. No document could be. But it represented a genuine attempt to learn from past failures and build something better. Mama Fatou lived to see the first fruits of the new system. A new hospital was built in her neighborhood, staffed by doctors who were actually paid on time and supplied with medicine that actually worked. Her grandson was able to attend a school where teachers showed up to teach. It wasn't paradise, but it was better. Noticeably and measurably better. "I never thought I would see this day," she told a journalist who interviewed her on the first anniversary of the courtroom incident. "For so long, we believed that corruption was just the way things were, that nothing could change. But we were wrong. Things can change. They did change, and we were the ones who changed them." Professor Kabore published his book about the revolution, which became required reading in universities across Africa. But he donated all his royalties to a foundation supporting education for poor students. "I spent my career talking about change," he wrote in the introduction. "Young people like Musa actually made it happen. The least I can do is support more young people to follow their example." Musa himself became a prominent civil society leader, founding an organization dedicated to monitoring government corruption and holding officials accountable. He understood that the work of maintaining democracy was never finished, that vigilance was required in every generation. What happened in that courtroom was a spark. Musa said in countless speeches and interviews. But a spark is not enough. You need fuel to keep the fire burning. That fuel is civic engagement. Citizens who stay informed, who speak out, who organize, who vote, who refuse to become complacent. The moment we assume the battle is won and stop fighting for justice is the moment corruption will return. 5 years after Officer Sankara's boot struck Captain Ibrahim's ribs, Burkina Faso held anniversary commemorations. The courthouse where it had all started was now a museum dedicated to the revolution. Visitors could see the actual courtroom, preserved exactly as it had been that day, including the defendant's chair that had skidded backward from the force of the kick. The museum included video testimonies from hundreds of people who had participated in the movement, protesters, soldiers who had refused orders, judges who had stood up to intimidation, journalists who had reported the truth despite threats. It was a collective memory, a reminder that change had not been the work of one person, but of thousands working together. Captain Ibrahim attended the commemoration ceremony, now retired from the military and working as a teacher. He looked older, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes retained that same calm certainty that had captivated the nation 5 years earlier. In his speech, he talked about the unfinished nature of their revolution. "We have come far," he said, "but we still have far to go. Corruption has not been eliminated. It has only been reduced. Inequality still scars our society. Justice is more accessible than it was, but not yet accessible to everyone. We cannot rest on our accomplishments. Each generation must recommit to the values we fought for: transparency, accountability, dignity, justice for all." Officer Sankara was released from prison that same week, having served his full sentence. He emerged into a country that had changed dramatically from the one he had known. He gave no interviews, issued no statements. He simply returned to his home village, where he spent his days working in his family's fields, trying to rebuild relationships with relatives he had neglected during his years of corruption. One day, he encountered Sergeant Diongo, who had continued to visit him throughout his imprisonment and had helped arrange a job for him upon release. They worked together in silence for a while before Sankara finally spoke. "Do you think I can be forgiven?" Diongo considered the question carefully. "I think forgiveness is possible for anyone willing to genuinely change. But it's not something you can demand or expect. It's something you have to earn through years of different choices, different actions. And even then, some wounds run too deep for forgiveness. All any of us can do is try to be better than we were yesterday." Judge Traoré, now quite elderly and nearing the end of his judicial commission work, sat in his office reviewing files one last time before retirement. He thought about the strange arc of his career, decades of moral compromise followed by a few years of genuine service. He wondered if the good he had done at the end could outweigh the harm he had enabled earlier. A knock on his door interrupted his reverie. It was a young law graduate, one of dozens who had entered the profession inspired by the reforms of recent years. She wanted advice on handling a complicated case involving powerful defendants. Judge Traoré smiled. "My advice is simple," he said. "Remember that you serve justice, not power. There will be pressure to compromise, to look the other way, to accept that corruption is inevitable. Resist that pressure. Every time you stand firm for what is right, you make it a little bit easier for the next person to do the same. Every time you compromise, you make corruption a little bit stronger. The choice is always yours." The young lawyer thanked him and left. Judge Traoré returned to his files, knowing that his own legacy would be mixed, but hoping that he had done enough good at the end to matter. Across Burkina Faso, similar stories were playing out. Some of those who had participated in the corrupt old system had genuinely changed. Others had simply adapted their methods, finding new ways to operate in the reformed environment. Some young people inspired by the revolution were entering public service with idealism and determination. Others were becoming cynical, disappointed that change hadn't happened faster or more completely. But what could not be denied was that something fundamental had shifted. The people had learned their own power. They had discovered that institutions could be changed, that corrupt officials could be held accountable, that justice was not a fantasy but a possibility that could be made real through collective action, and it had all started with a kick, a brutal assault that was meant to reinforce a corrupt system's power, but instead became the catalyst for its transformation. Violence intended to terrorize had instead awakened. A blow meant to break a man's spirit had instead broken the chains of fear and resignation that had bound an entire nation. In classrooms across Burkina Faso and beyond, teachers told their students about Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who absorbed violence with dignity and sparked a revolution through his refusal to be broken. They told them about Mama Fatou, who walked 3 kilometers to witness justice. They told them about Musa, who had the presence of mind to record history as it happened. They told them about Sergeant Diongo, who found the courage to arrest his superior officer. They told them about Judge Caboret, who discovered his conscience after decades of moral compromise. But most importantly, they told them about all the ordinary citizens whose names would never be famous, but whose collective action had transformed their country. Because in the end, that was the real lesson. Change does not require heroes. It requires ordinary people willing to act on their principles, to stand together, to refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. The kick that had been meant to crush dissent had instead awakened a nation, and that nation, once awakened, had refused to go back to sleep. The end.